Inadaptability and fatigue are only a weakness from the standpoint of those who mean to subjugate us. The truth is, inspiration is often unreliable. The only good cause is discipline. Yet even being an individual makes one a historical product of discipline. In the honest eyes of Foucault. Now, what does it mean to subjugate? To subjugate is to take hold of something and leverage oneself over that something. To subjugate is to make it submit, to disarm it, and even to annihilate it, until all of whatever it is gone. This subjugation, we understand, is ranging on a spectrum from an action maintained with the least power possible and required of you, or rather, a complete and utter waste of energy, or in video game terms, virtually overkill, whereby you do the complete opposite of being resourceful with what little you have or own, a real MacGyver. All that might stand in between those two extremes. It would be good to keep in mind how extremes in the theoretical domain often naturally balance out in real life, and they balance out specifically as the pure inertia of the mind faces the very real material obstacles towards that presumed friction. Whatever real life instance which this presumed friction may seem to be. Because as nature has proven many times and proven for aeons, its natural state is a homogeneous, static system or a dynamic, complex equilibrium. So what becomes of the difference in war? This is a duel against subjugation by the other, a duel on a larger scale, as we could analyze its value very probably, and that is to distinguish between what an individual is, the one historically fabricated by the great societal will. Rigidly distinguished premise here is that the collective force, a force of culture, that is the opposite of an individual, no matter how minuscule it really is from a universal and celestial perspective. This distinguished premise is as historically a product of power as the individual has become. Power in this sense becomes the power to act, and better yet, to take action. I don't know if you know this, but we must clarify, if you may remember from previous discourse, how we thoroughly and must thoroughly oppose this and all incidents of subjugation, which must be wrong by virtue of sovereignty. Our premise is that all subjugations pre-exist, especially as the fundamental antonym, the theoretical opposite of sovereignty, really. And may sovereignty sometimes demand of us subjugation? No, today is not opposite day. And in truth, we work in the arts of self-defense and retribution. As a society, no matter how mentally, as I see it, or physically even, such as the long arm of the law or vigilantes and mobs attacking the presumed criminality in an individual. I wish the good fortune of a just society, however we must get there one day. Never mind the concept of an independent spirit, because that is beyond the scope of this conversation here today. Sovereignty is the pre-existing condition of freedom from interference, the absolute state of not having some action committed against you, unjustly, no matter whatever justification. But one might say, greater folks than us have always existed. And it seems to me to be the case, other than always. We will be in another shadow, no matter how bright the light, destined for the individual shadows of those greater, who blot out the sun with their vast and far-reaching words and thoughts, really. I am not interested in the opposition between the individual and the so-called collective might, as this will become a false choice over time. This which it has shown to be. These rigid paradigms make their way into the public discourse to divide the population at the hands of the power by the state. So much like the individual, the social body too has often decided to rid itself of all kinds of ailments and disease. For one, and that we find too many bodies have strewn the path of these rigid ideologies, both the partial untruths of individualism versus collectivism, the social pariahs being too many ideologies from which we completely ignore the otherwise individual and independent context. We end up forcing our conversations into predetermined terrains of thought, no matter how unwittingly. These thought forms so-called fields of information within what is called the noosphere, spelled N-O-O sphere. These realms are much like the concept of biosphere, except the prefix of new means thought. You should already know that term bio means life, like an antibiotic or a bionic suit or a thriving biome. We force our thoughts into the specifically mindless noosphere that possesses absolutely no appreciation for originality. And with the growing world hegemony, we find a complete lackluster and soft mentality in this trite meme of the noosphere, a meme reproducing itself mindlessly, might I add, disgustingly, by the masses of random people. This all comes to fruition due to the impacts of ideology, nothing against the individual himself. And the ideology, whatever it may be, no matter how clear or unclear, neglects the power of the individual. The ironic noosphere denies the authenticity of autonomy, which I find much less abstract than so-called freedom. Freedom being the concrete unfreedom when illusions are shattered, when they're put to use by others against you, no matter how incorrect or wrong you otherwise don't think you are. When someone works for an ideology that is the power of the various status quos, they do add up to one vast ideological abstraction or separation from the real world, as it has, can, and must rise above material limitations. The one combined status quo, however diverse, the masses not only reproduce these memes of great quality, yet trivialize themselves in their own survival. The masses reproduce both the forms and the content of these memes in the noosphere, one day evolving above such bland and wasted potentials. This patternization of the noosphere, as it arrives from a perceived randomness into wasted potentials, this patternization, it arises from perceived randomness into order. It's precisely the shaping of this world which has been caused by Trump and those who preceded him all across the world, and will last for so long as these ideologies, even globally, all ideologies must cease, because we are one earth in a mighty universe. Here is the power of memes and the impact of the noosphere on the world of the individual. Before we discussed how, in the eyes of Foucault, the task is not to free the individual from power, but to free power from the individual. Well, I'm here to say to you today that today the individual is one of the greatest fabrications of all life, a complete product of the very prior circumstances being perpetuated throughout these lives, circumstances which give rise to these lives and reproduced and dying yet again and again across all history. What we seek here, and all else, to surpass some false notion of the individual, to shed our illusions of the individual plus the collective, and to harmonize ourselves between one another, no matter whether socioeconomically and politically, or religiously, philosophically, or otherwise. And by harmony, we do not mean assimilation, as many others have fought to defend it before us. Now, no matter how unwittingly, we concern ourselves with managing ourselves really in how we behave towards the self-same plus the other, or even life, whether lives as a whole, or that which we call the individual alone. The goal, considered in brief, is the health of the collective regulated by the passions of the individual, that which is all the healthy, collaborative passion. And in this sense, all subjugation, that is the opposite of power. It is my wish, below the shadow of false pseudo-power in which we must learn to live our lives, not merely survive. That is the best of us will be the ones who will thrive. That is my wish, and at the right and proper time as well. I want nobody to suffer. I want nobody to suffer, yet to explore creativity everywhere.